there's this thing where there's introverted and extroverted types, right? But what if you're an ambivert? Today I'm going to talk about introversion and extraversion, and I'm specifically going to talk about a certain overlap that I think exists between two types. So between the introverted version and the extroverted version of a type, and I'm going to explain what these different types are going to look like. So this has to do with how strong certain cognitive functions are, because I think this is generally accepted that the more you use a function, the better you're going to be at it. And depending on how introverted or how extroverted you are, you're going to also, alongside this preference for introversion or extraversion, you're going to have a preference, if you're very introverted, to use your introverted functions more. And when you're extroverted, you're going to have a preference to use your extroverted functions more. And I feel like that is going to change how your type looks. I believe there's two different possibilities for every type. So for every type you have the ambiverted version, and if it's an introverted type, the introverted version, and if it's an extroverted type, the extroverted version. So the thing is, everybody has a preference for either introversion or extroversion, you know? Everyone has a preference, and that's also what shows in your dominant function. But you can actually see huge differences between people in how introverted and extroverted they are. And I think, you know, there's a lot of cases where people seem kind of like they're ambiverted because, you know, they have a preference, but their preference isn't very strong. And I think that might even be quite common for people to be quite ambiverted, on the ambiverted side. Because, you know, it's not exactly about 50-50. It's like you have a preference, but it's close to 50-50, you know. So I drew this kind of overview where you can see two different types and a certain overlap area. So I just use INFJ and ENFJ as an example here, where you can see that there's two types of ENFJ, where the first one you can kind of choose what to call it, but either it's someone who is extremely extroverted, or it's someone who is just generally an extrovert, and then the other one is the ambivert, or the other one is just the extrovert rather than the extreme extrovert. But I think it's more easy to remember if you just call it ambivert, because the more you move to the ambiverted side, you know, the more you move to that side, the more you're going to look like this type. And the more you move to the extroverted side, the more you're going to look like the extroverted type. So the extroverted type of ENFJ has this thing where they use their extroverted sensing a lot because they're so extroverted. So they're going to be better at extroverted sensing, and they forget to use their NI a lot sometimes. They neglect their NI because they like to be extroverted so much. So their NI is going to be less developed than an ambiverted ENFJ. So you can see how I presented it. It's like NI had a certain downscale and SE had an upscale in proficiency. And blue kind of shows when you're really proficient at something, and yellow when you're moderately good at something, and orange when you're kind of deficient. So here you will see that the extroverted ENFJ is really good at FE, as it is their dominant function. They are moderately good at NI and moderately good at SE, and they're bad at TI, as it's the opposite of the dominant. So then we move to the ambiverted ENFJ. And when you look at ambiverted ENFJ, you see that I made the first two functions blue. This is how you would describe the official definition of an ENFJ. Even though I call it ambiverted here, because I feel like the more ambiverted you are, the more you're going to move to this type. But this is still the official definition of INFJ, because it's assumed that people are relatively balanced between introversion and extraversion. That's literally kind of the assumption. You know, when this type is being described according to the theory from Myers-Briggs, you know, it's kind of assumed that you're relatively balanced between extraversion and introversion, because it assumes that you're using your two highest functions, your dominant and auxiliary function. It's assumed that you use those two the most, and that you use them in kind of a balanced way. So this is, I feel almost like the classic ENFJ would kind of be an ambivert with a preference for extraversion. And you can see that I put the ambiverted INFJ right next to it, because I feel like that is the overlap area where people are going to, maybe if they're one of those two types, going to be a bit confused. Like, you know, if they're an ENFJ, they might wonder, like, am I actually an INFJ? And if they're an INFJ, they might wonder, am I actually maybe an ENFJ? Because as you can see, both of these types are going to be really good at both extroverted feeling and introverted intuition. And they also are going to both be relatively bad at extroverted sensing and introverted thinking. So I believe that they might be easily confused, and it's kind of an overlap area. You know, obviously there's still a difference, but it might be harder to tell the difference. Then, when we move to the introverted side, which, you know, again, it depends on how you want to call it. You can call them the extreme introverts. You can also just generally call them the introverts. But the more introverted you are, the more you're going to move towards that type. Because what they do, now we move on to the INFJ types. What this very introverted INFJ does is that they use their TI so much because of their introverted preference that their TI gets an upgrade, basically. And their FE that they're supposed to be good at gets a downgrade in terms of less development than for the ambiverted INFJ, because they don't use it enough. It's kind of like both types are in their element using introverted intuition. But whenever they need to start judging, you know, the ambiverted type is kind of going to be really comfortable with just using extroverted feeling during that time that they're judging. But the more introverted INFJ is going to prefer to stay introverted for the judging process and kind of use introverted thinking more and kind of balance TI and FE a lot more, whereas the ambiverted INFJ is kind of going to prefer to keep using FE most of the time, leading to different development of their auxiliary and tertiary function. But, you know, the thing is, they still have a lot of potential for extroverted feeling, and if they do develop it, if they do use it more and more, they can become really, really good at it. But the problem is that they're not doing that. What I, for example, notice, at least with myself, I would classify myself within the introverted type. I would say that in terms of extroverted feeling, I know that it's my auxiliary function, because it's this thing where, you know, extrovert feeling has a lot to do with kind of social intelligence, knowing what people need, knowing how people feel. What I especially noticed is kind of this thing of having social intelligence, but like not using it in a way where I would always be very aware of how people feel and stuff, and that I would not be like oblivious to that. I would be highly aware of it. But in practice, my social skills would not be very good, because I was so introverted that I never practiced extroverted feeling, and I would fall into introverted thinking, and I would never actually be able to stay in extroverted feeling mode, basically, and kind of have this interaction with your environment continuously, where you constantly react to people. You know, being extroverted is constantly being reactive to your environment, kind of staying in that FE mode and interacting in the moment, and by doing that actually developing those social skills. Because FE users who also just use it a lot have this thing where they develop their social skills because they can stay in their extroverted mode for a long time. Whereas I feel like maybe with really introverted INFJs, it's this thing where they have social intelligence because they have to use FE. Whenever they're being extroverted, they have to. So they do use it. And they're highly emotionally aware. But they might not practice it. They might not even be able to access it for long periods of time. And therefore it's kind of like they could do it, but they're still behind. You know, they're behind the ambiverted INFJs in their development of extrovert feeling. Even though they have this huge potential of potentially developing it, and also this kind of innate social awareness. So anyway, what I was saying, FE gets a downgrade, TI gets an upgrade. It's the same for the ambiverted INFJ. They could potentially really develop their TI to a relatively good level, but they don't do it because they prefer to stay in their extrovert feeling mode. So for the ambivert INFJ, TI is going to need some work. And for the introverted INFJ, FE is going to need some work. And I want to imply, this whole overlap can be used for any type. Just replace the functions with the functions of that type, and it's going to be exactly the same. I'm just using ENFJ and INFJ as an example here. And remember that every type still has the same potential for development. Their cognitive function order is the same. So they have the exact same potential for development. It's just that one of them has a head start with certain functions more than other functions because of their introversion or extroversion preference. So that's all I wanted to say about the overlap between extroversion and introversion. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!